Hi, good morning. Another one of my little recordings in which I'm trying to practice talking and whatnot. It struck me the other day, something that I think about actually a lot. Uh, Miguel de Cervantes and William Shakespeare both died in 1616. So, arguably the first novel. It's like I say, it's an argument. There's a great book called "The Man Who Invented Fiction" uh, that talks about Don Quixote as the first novel. You know, it's sort of arguable because there were narrative stories before that. The question is, was there a functional work that had chapters and is structured like a novel, the way that Don Quixote is? And part of the questions that are asked in that book are: did Cervantes and William Shakespeare know each other or had heard of each other? Because they're exact contemporaries. And of course, we don't know, but his general conclusion, the author, is that Cervantes probably had heard of Shakespeare, and Shakespeare had probably not heard of Cervantes. Um, it's really extraordinary because arguably, yes, the inventor of fiction per se, Don Quixote is either the greatest novel of all time or certainly one of the greatest novels, most notable novels of all time. Um, Endlessly metaphorical, endlessly relatable to any current time that you happen to be in. Um, in 4 centuries later, that's still the case. Um, and of course, William Shakespeare, greatest playwright that ever lived. One could argue about his sonnets too, as great poetry. Um, I don't have an argument with that. I think Shakespeare is wonderful. Um, I have my favorites, Richard III, and so on. And I always said that was the only, it was the only part I ever wanted to play was Richard III because, as an actor, I am canned ham. Um, when I was a kid, I played Macbeth in a high school thing. Never in a real play, um, but I just think that's fascinating that one could argue that at least two of the greatest literary figures, and possibly the two greatest literary figures, perhaps maybe with Homer, uh, existed at exactly the same time and have not been surpassed in the ensuing 400 years. I think it's sort of extraordinary, especially because all of us have a bias towards the present. We're always obsessed with the time in which we live. It's like in sports, the question is always, is so and so the greatest player that ever played? And it's whatever current player is the best at the time, whether it's basketball or baseball or football. Am I watching the greatest player of all time? And of course, we have a bias towards what we've seen and what we've known. And so we naturally assume that, you know, the players get better over time. Whereas writing doesn't necessarily get better out of time. Um, is there a better novelist than Tolstoy? Not very many. Uh, Anna Karenina is still a fantastic novel. Uh, and the same thing with plays. I mean, there's a lot of wonderful plays that I love that are up to the moment. But are any of them any better than Hamlet? As Hamlet is as definitive in Western culture as the Bible is. There are at least as many metaphors in Shakespeare as there are that come from the Bible. Just the way you know automatically what Jonah and the whale means. There's 100 different things. Providence is in the fall of a sparrow. 100 things that that derive from Shakespeare. Neither a borrower nor a lender be. Possibly people think that's from the Bible, but of course it's from Shakespeare. And I don't view this as a it's not a question of cultural dominance. It's just a realization of what is good, what is excellent in human production, and that does not necessarily invalidate or uh, or devalue any other thing that anybody else makes. It's just a recognition that they've set a standard that one can try to match, and one will probably fail. But it's not a bad thing to have these signposts out there to try and get to. When I write a play, I'm not thinking that I'm going to write a play that's better than Shakespeare. Um, I don't consider that, but I love to read Shakespeare and to see Shakespeare because it's endlessly creative, endlessly inventive, and endlessly potent with regard to examining the human condition. In much the same way Cervantes is. I mean, Quixotic, the whole idea of a Don Quixote is as central a figure to Western understanding as any other figure. And he's certainly that for me. And the older I get, the more I relate, of course, to Don Quixote. Um, the idea that we create our own reality. I mean, in some fashion, one could say that Don Quixote is the first anti-realist. He's creating his own reality as he lives, and he continues to exist in that reality even when it kicks him in the ass over and over again. But anyway, I think that's completely fascinating. The fact that they both died in 1616, that it arguably you can still create the Western canon even if there were no production of any works since the 17th century. Fairly remarkable. Anyway, it's just a thought.